The official story was a masterpiece of reassuring logic. In the hushed intelligence tent of the British 1st Airborne Division, Major Brian Urquhart spread the document on a wooden table, its crisp paper a stark contrast to the damp English soil under his boots. It was the Bible from which every planner for the coming invasion preached the SHAF intelligence summary. He read the words for the 10th time, feeling a familiar, not of professional unease tighten in his gut. German forces in Holland, it declared, were no longer a coherent force. They were a ghost army, a collection of hastily scraped-together units of old men and convalescing boys, unlikely to be able to mount a coordinated defense. It was the foundational assumption, the single pillar holding up the entire magnificent cathedral of the plan. And Urquhart was beginning to believe it was a lie. The truth, he suspected, lay in a different set of documents. Not the official dispatches from London, but flimsy, dirt-stained scraps of paper smuggled out of Holland. Messages from the Dutch underground, smelling of the damp earth they'd been buried in. They were precisely the kind of reports a busy staff officer, confident in his own sources, would dismiss as battlefield rumor. But they were specific. They spoke of troop movements in the night, of armored transports arriving by train. They mentioned veterans, not teenage conscripts. And then they used a word that had no place in the official story. A word that was like a shard of glass in a wedding cake. Panzers. The reports claimed SS Panzer divisions were refitting near Arnhem. Back in England, in the sterile quiet of the planning rooms at SHAF, the war felt very different. There, the war was a grand mathematical equation, and Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery believed he had finally solved it. His solution had a name that hummed with audacity and optimism: Operation Market Garden. And if you were a general looking at the map in that late summer of 1944, it was difficult not to fall in love with it. The plan was beautiful. You have to understand that. It wasn't just a military operation, it was a piece of art, a symphony of logistics and airborne daring. Imagine a dagger, long and impossibly thin. The blade was the British XXX Corps, a massive armored column that would punch north from the Belgian border. The jeweled hilt was the Allied Air Forces, and the lethal point of that dagger was 3 entire airborne divisions: the American 101st and 82nd, and the British 1st, dropped from the sky. Their mission was to seize a succession of bridges, creating a 60-mile-long airborne carpet for the tanks to race across, outflanking the Siegfried Line and plunging straight into the industrial heart of Germany. It was a single, 90% or nothing gamble to end the war by Christmas. And it was all designed to fight the ghost described in the official summary. It was built for speed, not a slugging match. It assumed the roads would be clear, the resistance brittle, and the path to victory paved with German collapse. When the whispers of panzers near Arnhem first reached the high command, the reaction was predictable. Disbelief. Annoyance, even. The staff officers scoffed. Impossible. The terrain was all wrong. Too soft, crisscrossed with canals. Besides, the remnants of the elite SS Panzer Corps were accounted for, licking their wounds deep inside Germany. These must be old French tanks, maybe a few armored cars. The resistance, brave as they were civilians. They saw a tracked vehicle and screamed tiger. The reports were filed away. But battlefield static, when ignored, has a habit of becoming a death rattle. And this piece of static was about to find a human voice. That voice belonged to Major Brian Urquhart. He lived and breathed the granular, bloody reality of intelligence, and he was deeply worried. The whispers from the Dutch resistance felt too specific, too persistent to be mere panic. So he did what a good intelligence officer does when faced with a contradiction between the beautiful plan and the ugly rumor. He demanded proof. He pushed, argued, and finally secured a reconnaissance flight over the woods near Arnhem. The photographs came back on September 16th, less than 24 hours before the Pars were scheduled to jump. In the hushed intelligence tent, Urquhart spread the glossy prints on the table. To the untrained eye, they showed nothing but trees and fields. But Urquhart leaned in closer, a magnifying glass shaking slightly in his hand. He wasn't looking for an army on the march. He was looking for shadows that shouldn't be there, for shapes that were just a little too regular, a little too geometric to be nature. And then he found them. Tucked beneath the canopy of a pear orchard, half covered in camouflage netting, was the unmistakable, brutal silhouette of a Panzer IV. Then another. and another. Then, the long, lethal barrel and blocky turret of a Tiger. He felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. This wasn't a ghost. It wasn't a rumor from a panicked farmer. It was the 9th and 10th SS Panzer Division's battle-hardened, fanatical veterans of the Eastern Front and Normandy parked directly, impossibly, on the landing zones of his men. The beautiful paper plan had just been confronted with a photograph of its own executioner. Those photographs weren't just evidence, they were a death warrant. Urquhart knew it in his bones. He was a doctor holding an X-ray that showed a fatal, inoperable tumor in a patient who was, at that very moment, being prepped for elective surgery. With the prints clutched in his hand, he raced to the headquarters of Lieutenant General Frederick Boy Browning, the charismatic and ambitious deputy commander of the 1st Allied Airborne Army. This was the moment of truth, the final chance for reality to intervene. To understand the weight of this meeting, you need to understand the beautiful, terrible fragility of the plan itself. Let's step into the War College for a moment. Think of Operation Market Garden not as an armored fist, but as a line of dominoes, each one a vital bridge, stood on end over 60 miles of hostile territory. The 101st Airborne had to knock over the first set at Eindhoven. The 82nd had to take the next at Grave and Nijmegen. And finally, the British 1st Airborne, the single domino balanced precariously at the very end of the line, had to seize the last bridge at Arnhem. If any one of them failed to fall, the entire line would stop dead. Now, imagine that next to that final domino Arnhem, someone has placed a sledgehammer. That sledgehammer was the 2 SS Panzer Corps. This is what Urquhart tried to explain to Browning. The Panzers changed the entire equation. The plan was predicated on speed, on a lightning-fast armored dash by XXX Corps up a road cleared by lightly armed paratroopers. But paratroopers are not designed to fight heavy armor. They are the scalpel, not the battle axe. Their job is to seize and hold, just long enough for the cavalry to arrive. The arrival of a Panzer division meant that the 1st Airborne wouldn't be fighting surprised sentries and disorganized rear echelon troops. They would be fighting a professional, mechanized killing machine, one that could isolate them, surround them, and systematically annihilate them long before a single British tank could ever reach them from the south. The entire airborne carpet would be cut to pieces, starting with the far end. Arnhem would become an island, a baited trap from which there was no escape. Browning listened, his expression a mask of aristocratic calm. He looked at the photographs, the damning, undeniable proof of German armor. He saw the shadows, the tracks in the mud, the gun barrels peeking from the trees. And then, he did something that sealed the fate of thousands of men. He dismissed it. The historical records are chillingly clear on his reaction. He waved a hand, a gesture of casual reassurance. "I wouldn't worry about them, Brian," he said, his voice betraying not a hint of alarm. "They're probably not serviceable at all. The men are probably looking for a rest." A rest. It was a failure of imagination so profound it bordered on criminal negligence. The system, the beautiful, intricate plan, was simply too big to stop. The momentum was too great. Hundreds of planes were fueled on airfields across England. Thousands of men were already checking their parachutes, their faces blackened with cork, their minds focused on the jump. To halt the operation now, on the word of one worried intelligence officer and a few grainy photographs, would be an admission of catastrophic failure before a shot was even fired. It was unthinkable. The plan had become an article of faith, and Browning was its high priest. The official story, the comforting lie of a broken enemy, was more powerful than the terrifying truth on a reconnaissance photo. Urquhart, a man trained to deal in facts, was left speechless. He had presented the irrefutable. He had laid the enemy's queen on the chessboard for all to see, and his commander had simply decided to pretend it was a pawn. Declared medically unfit to jump due to air sickness, a cruel irony for an intelligence officer who could see the coming disaster more clearly than anyone. Urquhart was ordered to remain behind. He was a Cassandra, cursed to see the future but powerless to prevent it. And so, the point of no return was crossed. As the sun rose on the morning of September 17, 1944, the largest airborne armada in history began to lift into the sky. In the vibrating fuselages of the Dakotas and the gliders, thousands of young men, the finest of their generation, laughed and sang, filled with the desperate hope that this one last push would end it all. They were flying toward a bridge, believing they were the key to victory. They had no idea they were flying directly into the guns of an enemy that High Command had assured them wasn't there. For a few breathtaking hours, the plan was real. For a few hours, the war as conceived on paper in England was the war being fought on the ground in Holland. From the sky, it was a sight of such staggering power and beauty it brought tears to the eyes of the pilots. 1,500 troop carriers and nearly 500 gliders, a river of steel and men flowing across the English Channel, blotting out the September sun. On the ground, for the paratroopers of the 101st and 82nd Airborne, the landing was a dream. The sky, clear and blue. The drop zones, largely undefended. The Dutch people, pouring out from their homes, weeping with joy, pressing flowers and apples into the hands of their liberators. It felt, in that first golden afternoon, like a victory parade that had simply started before the final battle. The hunt was on. Down south, the men of the 101st Airborne, the Screaming Eagles, consolidated with stunning efficiency. Their mission was the first, and perhaps most crucial, link in the chain to secure the 16 miles of road and the bridges around the city of Eindhoven, including the vital crossing over the Wilhelmina Canal at a small town called Sun. This was the main artery. Every tank, every truck, every gallon of fuel that XXX Corps needed to reach Arnhem had to pass over this bridge. Colonel Howard Salty Johnson and his 501st Parachute Infantry Regiment drew the assignment. As they double-timed it through the cheering crowds, the feeling was electric. This was it. The plan was working. The official story was true. The German resistance was collapsing just as predicted. They could see the bridge ahead, a graceful steel arch spanning the canal. It was intact. A wave of relief washed over the lead platoons. They were minutes away from securing the first great prize of the operation. They moved faster, the cheers of the Dutch still ringing in their ears, the taste of imminent victory in their mouths. They were investigators arriving at a crime scene before the crime had even been committed, ready to secure the evidence and close the case. They were less than 200 yards away when the world dissolved into a single, concussive roar. It wasn't the crack of a rifle or the chatter of a machine gun. It was a deep, guttural, earth-shattering boom that felt less like a sound and more like a physical blow to the chest. The ground beneath their feet jumped. The very air seemed to tear apart. A colossal fist of black smoke and fire erupted from the center of the bridge, climbing hundreds of feet into the pristine blue sky. Huge, jagged pieces of steel and concrete pinwheeled through the air, splashing down into the canal like prehistoric monsters. When the smoke cleared, the graceful arch was gone. In its place was a mangled, impassable ruin of twisted girders and shattered abutments, sinking slowly into the dark water. The paratroopers stared in stunned silence. The cheering from the town died, replaced by an awful, ringing quiet. German engineers, hidden on the far bank, had waited. They had watched the Americans approach, let them get close enough to taste success, and then, with perfect, disciplined timing, they had pushed the plunger. This single act of demolition was the first piece of hard, physical evidence from the battlefield. It was a clue that spoke with terrifying clarity. The enemy wasn't a ghost. They weren't broken. They were organized, they were disciplined, and they were thinking. They had just surgically severed the main artery of Market Garden. And with that explosion, the most precious, irreplaceable commodity of the entire operation began to bleed out time. Every minute the engineers of XXX Corps spent building a new bridge at Sun was a minute the paratroopers 60 miles north at Arnhem would have to fight and die alone. The beautiful, perfect clockwork of the plan had just lost its mainspring. While the engineers of XXX Corps swore and sweated over the wreckage of the Sun Bridge, a burst of good news crackled over the radios from further north. It was a pure, undiluted shot of American audacity. Near the town of Grave, a small platoon from the 82nd Airborne, led by a lieutenant named John Thompson, had done the impossible. Seeing the massive bridge over the Meuse River still standing, they didn't wait for orders. They didn't pause to form a plan. They simply charged, screaming, a mad, desperate sprint across 600 yards of exposed steel, firing their rifles from the hip. The German demolition guards were so stunned by the sheer suicidal bravado of the attack that they were cut down before they could even reach their detonators. The Grave Bridge was captured intact. It was a stunning victory, a moment that seemed to reaffirm the entire spirit of Market Garden. The plan, though wounded at Sun, was still alive. The next great prize, the true gateway to the final leg of the journey, was the city of Nijmegen. And there, looming over the wide, slate-gray waters of the Vaal River, was the bridge. This was no simple country crossing. It was a colossal, modern highway bridge, a 2,000-foot-long behemoth of steel arch and concrete, an artery capable of carrying the full weight of an armored corps at speed. And it, too, was intact. To General James Gavin, commander of the 82nd, it must have looked like a miracle. After the disaster at Sun, finding the Nijmegen Bridge undamaged felt like a reprieve from the gods of war. The promising lead was still there. The path to Arnhem was still open. But the Germans were not gods. They were soldiers. And their commander in the area, SS General Wilhelm Bittrich, was a student of a different kind of miracle, the miracle of tactical patience. He looked at the same bridge Gavin was looking at and saw not a liability to be destroyed, but a weapon to be used. Here we see the enemy's genius in its purest form. A lesser commander would have blown the bridge instantly, creating another delay, another engineering problem. Bittrich was more cunning than that. Why destroy the bait? He reasoned, when you can fortify the trap. He understood that the bridge was a magnet. The Allies had to take it. They would throw everything they had at it. So Bittrich made a calculated, cold-blooded decision: leave the bridge standing. Let them see it. Let them want it. And then kill them on its doorstep. When Gavin's paratroopers tried to advance into Nijmegen from their drop zones to the south, the official story of a broken, incoherent enemy finally, fatally, dissolved into the reality of street-to-street combat. The Americans weren't met by old men and invalids. They were met by the hardened combat troops of the 10th SS Panzer Division. These were not panicked conscripts, they were masters of urban warfare. Every window became a sniper's nest, every intersection a pre-sighted killing zone for machine guns. The paratroopers, armed with rifles and grenades, were fighting an enemy with assault rifles, Panzerfausts, and the cold, professional discipline of veterans. The advance on the bridge slowed, then stalled, then turned into a bloody, desperate crawl, measured in yards and casualties. The shocking truth began to dawn on the American commanders. The intact bridge wasn't an oversight. It wasn't a stroke of luck. It was a deliberate, tactical choice made by a clever and ruthless enemy. The promising clue that had offered so much hope was a dead-end lure into a perfectly prepared ambush. They were not the hunters closing in on a prize. They had been drawn into a grinder, a battle of attrition they were not equipped to win, against an enemy who wasn't supposed to be there. The investigation into the German collapse had stalled because the lead investigator had just walked into a room and found the supposed corpse pointing a gun at his head. And as the 82nd Airborne bled in the streets of Nijmegen, fighting for a bridge they couldn't reach, the delay at Sun became more than an inconvenience. It was now a catastrophe. The two great dominoes in the middle of the line, Sun and Nijmegen, were refusing to fall. 60 miles to the north, the men of the British 1st Airborne had landed and were marching towards their own bridge, completely unaware that the cavalry was not coming. Not yet. Maybe not ever. 60 miles north, in the gathering dusk around Arnhem, Lieutenant Colonel John Frost was running out of patience. He was a quintessential British officer, stoic, unflappable, with a neatly trimmed mustache and a gaze that seemed to miss nothing. While the rest of his division was being bled white in ambushes in the woods west of the town, Frost and his 2nd Battalion had done something extraordinary. They had found a gap, a forgotten path, a series of quiet back roads that the Germans had, for a few precious hours, left unguarded. It was a classic case of what soldiers call finding the seam, the weak point between two enemy units. While the main body of the 1st Airborne was smashing its head against the rock of the 9th SS Panzer Division, Frost had simply walked around it. By 8 o'clock that evening, under a sky streaked with the last embers of daylight, Frost and his 750 men stood at the northern ramp of their prize, the Arnhem Bridge. It rose before them in the twilight, a magnificent steel arc, silent and waiting. They had done it. Against all odds, the spear point of the entire operation had reached its target. But as they crept forward, a sickening feeling of isolation began to set in. The radios were dead. Static. Nothing but the hiss of empty airwaves where there should have been the reassuring voices of the rest of the division, of the 82nd Airborne, of XXX Corps. They were utterly, terrifyingly alone. Just as they prepared their assault, a German staff car came rattling across the bridge from the south. Frost's men opened up a furious fusillade that stitched the vehicle from end to end and sent it careening into a pylon. The battle for the Arnhem Bridge had begun. Frost's paratroopers swarmed the northern approach, seizing a cluster of sturdy Dutch houses that overlooked the ramp, turning them into a fortress. From these windows, they could command the entire northern end of the bridge with machine guns and PIT anti-tank projectors. But the bridge itself remained in no man's land. The Germans on the southern side, now fully alerted, were dug in and determined. It was in this stalemate, in the sudden, shocking violence of that first night, that the breakthrough came. Not from a frontal assault, and not from the silent radios. It came from a piece of technology so mundane, so overlooked in the grand scheme of things, that its importance was almost comical: a captured German telephone. In the cellar of one of the houses they had occupied, a British signaller, fiddling with the wires, discovered the civilian telephone line running under the river to the south bank was still active. He could hear the Germans talking. It was a direct line into the enemy's command post. This was the unlikely source, the forgotten clue that changed everything for the men at the bridge. They couldn't talk to their friends, but they could listen to their enemies. Through the crackle of the line, they began to piece together a terrifyingly clear picture of their predicament. They heard the frantic calls for reinforcements, the reports on British positions, the orders being given to organize counterattacks. They learned the German dispositions, their strengths, their weaknesses. It was a raw, unfiltered stream of intelligence that allowed Frost's small, isolated battalion to anticipate every German move. When a German assault was being formed up on the south bank, Frost's men were ready for it. When a probe was sent across the bridge, the machine guns were already sighted in. The telephone line became their secret weapon, a lifeline of information in a sea of silence. It revealed a new, more dangerous path forward, not to wait for rescue, but to fight and survive, using the enemy's own nervous system against them. The bridge was not yet theirs, but thanks to a forgotten piece of civilian infrastructure, they now had a fighting chance to hold their small piece of it until the phantom army of XXX Corps finally arrived. Back in the relative sanity of XXX Corps headquarters, some 50 miles south of Frost's desperate fortress, Major General Roy Urquhart was fighting a different kind of war. His battle was not with panzers, but with static, with silence, and with the maddeningly optimistic dispatches from Browning's Airborne headquarters. He was the commander on the ground, struggling to get a clear message from his own 1st Airborne Division, while his division's own intelligence officer, Major Brian Urquhart, had been the one whose warnings to high command had gone unheard. The official story he was receiving was one of success. Landing successful, the early reports read. Light opposition. Bridges being secured. It was a narrative crafted from hope, not from the garbled, frantic radio intercepts that were painting a far darker picture. Urquhart was trapped in the worst kind of fog of War I created by his own side. His division had effectively ceased to exist as a coherent unit, scattered and bleeding in the woods around Oosterbeek, and yet he couldn't get a clear message out, or in. The truth, however, had a way of seeping through the cracks. It arrived not in a clean signal, but in a bloody, exhausted package. A handful of glider pilots, shot down on the first day, had managed to evade capture. They had walked for 2 days through enemy territory, seeing with their own eyes what the reconnaissance photos had only hinted at. They didn't bring back strategic analysis, they brought back soldiers' truth. They spoke of panzers, not in ones and twos, but in squadrons. They described the shocking firepower of German units that were supposed to be convalescing. They talked of organized, disciplined resistance on a scale that made a mockery of the pre-invasion intelligence. But the most damning piece of evidence was something far more tangible, something pulled from the wreckage of a crashed British glider. On September 18th, a German patrol from the 9th SS Panzer Division stumbled upon the crash site. Inside the splintered fuselage, amidst the bodies of the British glider pilots, they found a briefcase. It was intact. Inside that briefcase was a complete, unabridged copy of the entire Operation Market Garden battle plan. Timetables, drop zones, objectives, radio frequencies, the planned route of XXX Corps, everything. It was the Rosetta Stone of the Allied invasion, delivered directly into the hands of the one man most capable of exploiting it. Field Marshal Walther Model, a master of defensive warfare, initially thought the plan was a plant, a deception so audacious it couldn't possibly be real. It was too perfect. It laid bare every Allied intention, every vulnerability. But as reports flooded in of airborne landings exactly where the captured documents said they would be, disbelief turned into crystalline certainty. He now held the enemy's playbook. He knew their ultimate destination, Arnhem. He knew the route the relief column had to take. He knew which bridges were vital. The fog of war, for the Germans, had lifted completely. They no longer had to guess where the next blow would fall. They could read it on a timetable. This was the uncomfortable truth that began to filter back to Allied command, not as a coherent report, but as a change in the enemy's behavior. Suddenly, German resistance wasn't just stubborn, it was intelligent. It was predictive. Attacks were being launched not just where the British were, but where they were going to be. The narrow, single road that XXX Corps relied on, a road that would become known as Hell's Highway, was being systematically cut and ambushed at key choke points, precisely the points a commander would target if he knew the entire Allied strategy. The system wasn't just pushing back, it was counterpunching with uncanny precision. The Allies were no longer fighting a disorganized remnant. They were fighting an enemy who could read their minds. In the command caravan of XXX Corps, General Brian Horrocks chewed on his mustache and stared at the map. The map was supposed to be a tool of liberation, a chart of victory. Now, it looked like a diagram of a failing circulatory system. The main artery, Hell's Highway, was clotting. Every time his engineers repaired one blockage, like the Sun Bridge, the Germans would create another one further up. Small, fanatical battle groups, armed with Panzerfausts and machine guns, would materialize from the autumn mists, cut the road, destroy a few tanks and trucks, and then melt back into the marshy landscape. Horrocks was a brilliant and aggressive commander, but he was fighting a ghost that knew his every move. His powerful armored corps, the mighty mailed fist of the British Army, was reduced to inching its way up a single, treacherous road, constantly looking over its shoulder. The reports reaching Browning's airborne headquarters were now a confused mess of contradictions. From the 82nd Airborne came desperate pleas for armored support to break the stalemate at Nijmegen. From XXX Corps came frustrating reports of endless delays on Hell's Highway. And from the 1st Airborne at Arnhem, there was mostly silence. A terrifying, profound silence, punctuated by a few, impossibly faint radio messages that spoke of heavy opposition and encirclement. The system, the vast, intricate bureaucracy of the Allied command structure, reacted not with alarm, but with a kind of institutional denial. The plan was still the plan. The timetable, though delayed, was still the timetable. High Command, sitting miles away in England and France, saw the Panzers not as a fundamental flaw in the plan's premise, but as a local difficulty to be overcome. The cognitive dissonance was staggering. Imagine a team of architects being told by a frantic construction worker that the building's foundation is crumbling, only to look at their perfect blueprints and reply, "Impossible. The drawings show the foundation is sound." This denial manifested as a series of tragically misguided orders. The Polish 1st Independent Parachute Brigade, commanded by the fiercely proud Major General Stanislaw Sosabowski, was scheduled to be the final wave of reinforcements for Arnhem. Sosabowski, a deeply skeptical veteran who had distrusted the plan from the start, was ready to jump. But bad weather and, more critically, a failure at headquarters to grasp the sheer desperation of the situation led to delay after delay. When the order finally came, it wasn't to reinforce Frost at the bridge, which was now impossible. It was to drop on the south side of the river near the village of Driel, into the teeth of the waiting 10th SS Panzer Division. It was a suicide order, born of a complete disconnect from the reality on the ground. Sosabowski protested vehemently. His intelligence was clear: the landing zone was hot, the ferry needed to cross the river was gone, and the British on the other side were on the verge of annihilation. He was, in effect, the whistleblower, screaming that the building was on fire. The system pushed back. His protests were viewed as insubordination, the pessimism of a difficult subordinate. He was given a direct order from Browning's headquarters: "You will jump." That is an order. The official story had to be maintained. The reinforcements had to be sent, even if it was into a meat grinder. The beautiful plan on the map took precedence over the ugly, bloody truth being lived by the men it was supposed to save. At the northern ramp of the Arnhem Bridge, the world had shrunk to a few burning houses filled with ghosts. For 4 days and 4 nights, John Frost's 750 men had held the unholdable. They had done their job. The plan had promised them relief in 48 hours. That deadline had passed, twice over. Now, there was no more ammunition to redistribute, no more medical supplies for the ever-growing rows of wounded men lying in the cellars, and no more hope. The sturdy Dutch houses they had turned into a fortress were now their tomb, systematically pulverized into brick dust by the methodical shelling of SS Panzers. The German telephone line that had been their lifeline was long dead. All that was left was the static of their own radios and the final, bitter duty of the soldier. History remembers their courage, but it often forgets the silence that answered it. Sometime on the 4th day, a signaller, his face black with soot and exhaustion, managed to get one last, faint message through the ether. It was a message born of absolute finality, a last will and testament broadcast into an indifferent sky. The transmission was brief, laced with the crackle of fires and the crump of incoming mortar rounds out of ammunition. God save the king. Then, the radio went dead for the last time. The fight for the bridge was over. The survivors, those who could still walk, were rounded up, their faces hollowed out by a fatigue beyond comprehension. They had seized their objective. They had held it, and the plan had abandoned them there to die. 17 miles to the southwest, the price of truth was being paid in Polish blood. General Sosabowski, the man who had seen this disaster coming, was living his own personal nightmare. His paratroopers had jumped, as ordered, into the killing ground at Driel. They landed under a hail of fire, on a landing zone that felt as open and exposed as a billiard table. Their objective was to cross the lower Rhine and reinforce the remnants of the 1st Airborne in Oosterbeek. But the ferry they were meant to use was gone, its thick steel cable severed by German machine gun fire, its wreck lying half-submerged on the opposite bank. They were stranded. That night, under a cold, clear moon, they tried the impossible. Using a few tiny, inflatable boats and a makeshift rope, they attempted to paddle across the wide, fast-flowing river. The Germans on the high ground of the Westerbowing Heights on the other side simply waited. They held their fire until the rafts were in the middle of the current, and then they opened up with everything they had, turning the river into a churning, silver-lit slaughterhouse. For Sosabowski, it was the bitterest kind of vindication. He had warned them, and for his wisdom, he was now forced to watch his men die in a futile gesture born of his superior's blindness. And then, in the cruelest imaginable twist of fate, the breakthrough came. At Nijmegen, after days of bloody stalemate, the Allies finally threw their last dice. While American paratroopers of the 82nd Airborne paddled across the Vaal River in 26 flimsy canvas boats, a daylight suicide charge that has become a legend of military valor, the tanks of the Irish Guards stormed the northern end of the road bridge. The city fell. The great bridge was theirs. At long last, after all the delays, the blood, and the blunders, the way was clear. The tanks of XXX Corps began to rumble north, their path to Arnhem finally, blessedly, open. But the cheers died in their throats. They had fought and bled for this road, for this one chance to save the men at the end of it. And now, as they looked north across the flat Dutch polder, they saw only the smoke rising from the ruins of Oosterbeek and Arnhem. The road was open, but the bridge at the end of it now led only to a graveyard. The great armored column of XXX Corps, the dagger that was supposed to plunge into the heart of Germany, finally ground to a halt just 10 miles south of Arnhem. The bridge at Nijmegen had been won, but the victory felt hollow, tasting of ash. The radio silence from the 1st Airborne was no longer a mystery to be solved, it was an epitaph to be read. To advance further, into the teeth of 2 refitted Panzer divisions, with no friendly forces left on the other side of the river, was not a rescue. It was suicide. The dagger had been broken. Operation Market Garden was over. What followed was not a battle, but an evacuation. A managed retreat under the cover of darkness and driving rain. The official name was Operation Berlin. For the men on the ground, The survivors of the 1st Airborne Division huddled in their last perimeter around the Hartenstein Hotel in Oosterbeek. It was a desperate, whispered flight from hell. Of the more than 10,000 men who had landed so full of hope and confidence 9 days earlier, fewer than 2,200 made it back across the river. They came in ragged groups, ghosts emerging from the woods, their uniforms in tatters, their faces etched with the kind of primal exhaustion that comes only from staring into the abyss. They were ferried across the churning water of the lower Rhine by Canadian and British engineers in small boats, the whole scene illuminated by the hellish orange glow of burning buildings on the northern bank. From the perspective of those exhausted survivors, the catastrophe was absolute. They had seen the plan's beautiful logic shatter against the brutal arithmetic of German firepower. They had listened to the silence on the radios as the world they were promised failed to materialize. They had held on for 2 days, then 4, then 9, fueled by a dwindling supply of courage and a stubborn refusal to surrender. Every bursting shell, every failed radio call, every fallen comrade was a testament to the ignored warning, a bloody consequence of those dismissed reconnaissance photographs. And for the man who had tried to stop it, the irony was almost too much to bear. Major Brian Urquhart, the intelligence officer who had seen the Panzers in the pictures, had been forced to remain in England. He had spent the 9 days of the battle in an agony of impotence, listening to the fragmented reports, knowing exactly what was happening, exactly why it was happening, and utterly powerless to change it. He was the prophet whose prophecies had come true in the most horrific way imaginable. He had seen the iceberg on the charts, but the captain had ordered full steam ahead anyway. Now, all he could do was listen to the reports of the lifeboats coming back, counting the empty seats and knowing, with a sickening certainty, that every single loss had been preventable. The unfolding disaster was not just a military failure for him. It was a profound and personal tragedy, the direct result of a truth he had seen, spoken, and had thrown back in his face. In the immediate aftermath, the system did what systems do: it protected itself. The official narrative was quickly cemented. Operation Market Garden, the after-action reports concluded, was 90% successful. It was a gallant failure, undone not by a catastrophic intelligence blunder, but by unforeseeably bad weather and the unexpectedly rapid recovery of German forces. It was a tragedy, yes, but a heroic one. Blame, a commodity as carefully rationed as fuel in wartime, needed a home. And it found one. Years later, long after the war was a memory etched in stone and bronze, the documents began to surface. Declassified memos from SHAF, transcripts of intercepted German communications, and most damningly, the personal diaries and post-war testimonies of the men who were there. The truth, buried for decades under a mountain of official histories and political necessity, began to emerge, piece by painful piece. A scapegoat had been required, and a convenient one was found in the proud, difficult Pole, General Stanislav Sosabowski. In the sanitized version of the story, his failure to effectively cross the Rhine and relieve the British was cited as a key factor. He was the one who had complained, the one who had questioned the plan. In December 1944, under pressure from the British High Command, the Polish government in exile was forced to relieve him of his command. Sosabowski, the man who had been right when everyone else was wrong, was publicly disgraced, his career destroyed. He lived out his life in West London, working as a factory laborer for CV Electrics, a forgotten Cassandra whose warnings had been ignored and then used to condemn him. His vindication would not come in his lifetime. And then there was the briefcase. For decades, the story of the captured battle plan was treated as a German propaganda myth, or at best, a minor footnote. But post-war interviews with German commanders, including Bittrich's own chief of staff, confirmed it in chilling detail. They described Field Marshal Model's initial disbelief turning to triumphant certainty. They explained how that single, incredible piece of intelligence allowed them to orchestrate the defense of Holland not as a panicked reaction, but as a symphony of destruction. They knew exactly where to place their reserves, which roads to cut, which bridges to defend to the last man. The declassified truth was that for the entire 9 days of the battle, the Allies were not just fighting the Wehrmacht and the SS, they were fighting their own, captured, perfectly legible plan. Perhaps most poignantly, The files revealed the full story of Major Brian Urquhart. After the battle, he was quietly transferred. His prescient warnings, his desperate pleas to his commander, General Browning, were never officially acknowledged in the reports. They were an inconvenient truth, a record of a moment where the entire disaster could have